Every parent's worst nightmare is losing their children and never knowing if they're safe. For Halvard, an aging Viking warrior, that nightmare became reality decades ago when raiders took his 2 daughters. Now he wanders slave markets, haunted by what he's lost. When he sees 2 terrified sisters being sold, their defiant eyes remind him of his own girls. The crowd mocks the old Viking for wasting silver on them, but Halvard steps forward anyway. "I'll take you home," he tells them. What starts as one man's attempt at redemption becomes a journey that will heal 3 broken souls. Through frozen landscapes and painful memories, an unlikely family begins to form. The sisters learn to trust. Halvard learns to hope again. But can saving 2 lives truly make up for all the families he once destroyed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung thick over the slave market in Winchester, carrying with it the stench of unwashed bodies, fear, and desperation. Halvard stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hand resting on the pommel of his sword, not from habit, but from the weight of memories that pressed down on him like stones in a burial mound. He had not come here to buy. He never came to buy. For 3 years now, he had wandered these markets across England and Francia, searching faces that would never be there, hoping for daughters who were likely long dead. The silver arm ring on his wrist, worn thin from years of nervous twisting, was all that remained of his former wealth. Once, he had commanded 3 longships and 50 warriors. Once, men had trembled at the mention of his name. Now he was just another aging Norseman with hollow eyes and too many ghosts. The auctioneer's voice cut through his brooding like an axe through wood. Next, we have 2 sisters, captured from a manor house north of here. Fine breeding, these ones. Young enough to train, old enough to work. Halvard's head lifted slowly. He had learned not to look too closely at the children brought to these blocks. It only brought pain, and he had carried enough of that for several lifetimes. But something in the auctioneer's tone, a note of cruel satisfaction, drew his attention. Despite himself, 2 girls stood on the wooden platform, chains binding their wrists. The elder couldn't have been more than 16, her dark hair matted but still holding traces of careful braiding. Her sister, perhaps 14, pressed close against her side like a frightened bird seeking shelter. But it wasn't their fear that stopped Halvard's breath in his throat. It was their eyes defiant, fierce, unbroken despite everything they had endured. His own daughters had looked at him that same way the morning the raiders came. Ingrid, barely 15, had stood in front of her younger sister Thora with a kitchen knife in her trembling hands. "You won't touch her," she had snarled at the Danish warriors who had somehow bypassed every defense Halvard had built around his settlement. He had been 3 days' sail away, raiding a monastery on the Irish coast when his world ended. "Look at them," the auctioneer continued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who sold human misery for profit. Nobility written in every line. The older one fought like a wildcat when we took them, broke 2 men's noses before we got the chains on her. But don't worry, buyers. A few months in the right hands, and she'll be docile as a lamb. The crowd laughed. Halvard felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. The elder sister Astrid, he heard someone call her, lifted her chin higher. Even chained, even terrified, she stood like a queen facing execution. Her arm tightened around her sister's shoulders, and Halvard could see her lips moving in what might have been prayer or promise. The younger one, Brenna, buried her face against her sister's shoulder, but didn't weep. Their strength in the face of such horror was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "What's the bidding start at?" called a voice from the crowd. A merchant by his clothes, fat and prosperous, eyeing the girls with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. 20 silver pieces for the pair," the auctioneer replied. 15, the merchant countered. The little one looked sickly. Halvard's jaw clenched. Brenna wasn't sickly. She was terrified and exhausted. Probably hadn't eaten properly in days. He had seen that same hollow-eyed look in his own daughter's faces when times were hard, when his raids failed and winter stretched. Long and cruel. 15 it is, called another voice. A younger man this time, his intentions written plain in the way his eyes lingered on Astrid's form. Though I'd prefer just the older one. The young one's more trouble than she's worth. Astrid's head snapped. Toward the speaker, her eyes blazing with such fury that even chained and helpless, the man took a step back. Her sister trembled, but stood straighter, drawing strength from her sister's defiance. The bidding continued, growing more heated as more men began to see opportunity in the sister's obvious nobility. Their breeding would make them valuable, whether for household service or darker purposes that Halvard didn't want to contemplate. The price climbed 20, 25, 30 pieces of silver dot with each bid. Astrid's grip on her sister tightened. With each lewd comment from the crowd, Brenna pressed closer to her protector. They had no one else in this world but each other, and even that was about to be torn away. Halvard closed his eyes and saw Ingrid's face again. Saw her standing with that kitchen knife, her voice cracking as she tried to sound braver than she felt. "You won't touch her." The last words he had ever heard his daughter speak, because when he returned to find his settlement burned and his family gone, there had been no trace of them except bloodstains on the floor of his own hall. For 23 years, he had lived with the knowledge that while he was off earning gold and glory, his daughters were being dragged away in chains, probably to markets just like this one. For 23 years, he had wondered if they had stood on similar blocks, if they had looked into crowds of leering strangers and found no friendly face, no one willing to step forward and pay whatever price was asked. 35 silver, the fat merchant called out, his voice growing excited. "And I'll take them both." The auctioneer nodded, clearly pleased with the price. "Any other bids?" 35 silver pieces, going once. Halvard stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly as his massive frame moved through them. He had been a large man in his prime, and age had made him leaner but no less imposing. His gray-streaked beard was braided with iron rings, and the scars that marked his arms and face told stories of countless battles. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority that came from commanding warriors in life-and-death situations. 70 silver pieces. A murmur ran through the crowd. The merchant who had been bidding spun around, his face flushing red with anger. 70? That's madness. And not worth half that. Halvard didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the two girls, and for just a moment, Astrid met his gaze. He saw her confusion, her desperate hope warring with learned caution. She had probably seen too many men claim to be her savior only to prove themselves worse than her captors. 70 silver pieces, Halvard repeated calmly. "And I'll pay now." The auctioneer's eyes went wide. "Sir, that's quite generous." "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." Halvard reached into his leather pouch and began counting out the coins. It was nearly every piece of silver he owned, the remnants of his once great wealth. Enough to buy a small farm or a boat or passage to the new world that some spoke of. Instead, he was spending it on two girls whose names he didn't even know. The crowd fell silent as he counted, the only sounds the clink of silver and the distant calls of other merchants hawking their wares. When he finished, he looked up at the auctioneer and then, finally, at the sisters. "I'll take you home," he said simply. Astrid's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie she expected to find there. But Halvard had learned many things in his 60 years, and one of them was that truth, no matter how hard, was always better than false comfort. He wasn't promising them an easy road or a return to their old life. He was promising them only what he could give: protection, care, and a place where they could heal. The auctioneer gestured to one of his assistants, who unlocked the sisters' chains with hands that shook slightly. Halvard's reputation, while faded, was still remembered in these parts. Men who traded in human misery tended to have long memories when it came to those who might object to their business practices. As the chains fell away, Brenna stumbled and nearly fell. Instinctively, Halvard moved forward to steady her, but Astrid was faster. She caught her sister and pulled her back, putting herself between Brenna and their new owner. The message was clear. She would protect her sister from any threat, even if that threat had just paid to free them. Halvard nodded approvingly. The girl had spirit, and she loved her sister. Those were qualities he respected, even if they made his own task more difficult. "Come," he said gently, backing away to give them space. "We have a long journey ahead." As they walked through the market crowds, Halvard could feel the weight of stares and whispered comments. Some knew his reputation from the old days. Halvard the Ruthless, who had burned coastal settlements from Scotland to Brittany. Others simply saw an aging Viking who had just spent a fortune on 2 slave girls. Neither group understood the truth, that he was a father who had failed his own children and was now trying, perhaps too late, to save someone else's. The sisters followed at a careful distance, Astrid's arms still wrapped protectively around Brenna's shoulders. Neither spoke, but Halvard could feel their eyes on him, measuring, evaluating, trying to understand what kind of man had bought them and what he might want in return. He led them to where his horse was tethered, a sturdy gelding that had carried him faithfully for 3 years of wandering. The animal was loaded with his few possessions: bedroll, cooking pot, the tools of a man who lived rough and traveled light. It wasn't much, but it was honest gear, free of the golden ornaments and fine weapons that might mark him as someone who profited from others' misery. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Astrid lifted her chin. "We can walk. It's 200 miles to the coast," Halvard replied matter-of-factly. "Then another week by sea. You'll ride, or we'll never make it before winter." For a moment, the sisters exchanged glances, some silent communication that spoke of shared hardship and mutual trust. Finally, Astrid nodded once, a sharp movement that conveyed resignation more than acceptance. Halvard helped them onto the horse's broad back, noting how Astrid positioned herself behind her sister, still maintaining her protective stance. As they prepared to leave Winchester behind, he looked back once at the slave market where other children still stood on the auction blocks, waiting for their fates to be decided by strangers with purses full of silver. He couldn't save them all. He had learned that bitter truth long ago. But perhaps, if the gods were kind, he could save these 2. Perhaps that would be enough to balance the scales of a life spent taking rather than giving. As they rode north toward the uncertain future, Halvard allowed himself a moment of something that might have been hope. The sisters were alive. They were together. And for the first time in 23 years, he had a purpose beyond his own pain. Behind them, the smoke of Winchester's fires rose into the gray sky. Ahead lay the long road home, and the chance, just the chance, that redemption might still be possible for an old warrior who had finally learned to choose love over violence. The journey had begun. The first 3 days were the hardest. Astrid and Brenna rode in silence, their bodies rigid with tension despite their exhaustion. They spoke to each other in whispers when they thought Halvard wasn't listening, their voices carrying the weight of shared trauma and desperate planning. He caught fragments, discussions of escape routes, assessments of his weapons, quiet reassurances that they would face whatever came together. He pretended not to hear. Let them plan, let them hope. It would take time for them to understand that he meant them no harm, and he had learned patience in his wandering years. Trust, once broken, could not be forced back into existence. It had to be earned, one careful action at a time. They left Winchester by the northern road, avoiding the main trading routes where questions might be asked about a grizzled Viking traveling with two obviously noble-born girls. Halvard knew these lands well. He had raided them in his younger days, when such things seemed not just acceptable but necessary for survival. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now protecting English children in the same forests where he had once hunted their countrymen. On the first night, they made camp in a grove of ancient oaks, their massive trunks providing windbreak and concealment. Halvard had built countless campfires in his lifetime, but never under such delicate circumstances. Every movement was calculated to appear unthreatening. He kept his weapons sheathed, moved slowly, and maintained a respectful distance from the sisters at all times. "Eat," he said quietly, offering them strips of dried meat and hard bread from his pack. Astrid stared at the food as if it might be poisoned. Her sister pressed closer to her side. Both girls huddled together like wounded animals expecting the next blow to fall. "Not hungry," Astrid said, her voice carefully controlled. Halvard nodded and set the food on a flat stone between them. "It will be there when you are." He settled himself across the fire from them, close enough to provide protection, but far enough away that they wouldn't feel cornered. As darkness fell and the forest came alive with night sounds, he watched them from the corner of his eye. They took turns sleeping, one always on guard while the other rested. Smart girls. They had learned the hard lessons of survival. Near midnight, when he thought they were both asleep, he heard the soft sound of movement. Astrid was carefully reaching for the food he had offered, her movements so slow and quiet that in his younger days he might not have noticed. She tore off small pieces of bread and fed them to her sister, who accepted them with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. Halvard closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, allowing them this small dignity of thinking. They were stealing food rather than accepting charity from their captor. The second day brought rain, a cold, penetrating drizzle that soaked through their clothes and turned the road to mud. Halvard fashioned a crude shelter from his cloak and some branches, large enough for the sisters to huddle beneath. He sat outside, letting the rain run off his weathered leather vest, keeping watch while they tried to stay dry. "You'll catch your death," Astrid said suddenly. It was the first time she had addressed him directly since leaving Winchester. "I've been wet before," Halvard replied without looking at her. "We could his room." The offer surprised him. He turned to study her face, looking for the calculation behind the gesture. Was she trying to lull him into vulnerability? Or was this genuine concern for his welfare? Her expression gave nothing away. She had learned to guard her thoughts well. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "But I'm fine here." Something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment? Relief? He couldn't be sure. That night, she ate the food he offered without pretense, and even encouraged Brenna to take her share. Small steps, but progress nonetheless. The third day brought their first real test. They were following a deer track through dense woodland when Halvard's horse suddenly lifted its head, ears pricked forward in alarm. He pulled the animal to a halt and listened, his battle-trained senses reaching out through the forest sounds, hoofbeats, multiple riders, moving fast and trying not to be heard about it. "Get down," he said quietly, helping the sisters dismount. "Into those brambles there. Don't make a sound, no matter what happens." Astrid's eyes widened with fear, but she obeyed without question, pulling Brenna with her into the thorny undergrowth. They had learned to recognize danger in the past weeks, and whatever they heard in Halvard's voice convinced them that this was not a time for questions. 6 riders burst into the clearing moments later, their horses lathered with sweat and their weapons already drawn. Halvard recognized the type immediately: mercenaries, probably working for whoever had been tracking slave purchases in Winchester. They had the look of men who lived by violence and weren't particular about their targets. "You there," called their leader, a thin man with a scarred face and predator's eyes. We're looking for 2 girls. Young ones, traveling with an old Norseman. Seen anyone matching that description?" Halvard let his hand rest casually on his sword hilt, a gesture that appeared relaxed but positioned him for a quick draw. "Can't say I have. Roads are dangerous these days. Smart folk travel alone." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing is, the merchant in Winchester describes someone who looks a lot like you. Big man, gray beard, more silver than sense. They'd 70 pieces for a pair of runaway slaves. 70 silver?" Halvard raised an eyebrow, allowing a note of amused disbelief to enter his voice. "For slaves? Any man fool enough to pay that price deserves whatever trouble finds him." One of the other riders shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Waste of time, Marcus. This old goat doesn't know anything." But Marcus wasn't convinced. He urged his horse closer, studying Halvard's face with the intensity of a man who made his living reading lies. "See, here's what I think happened. I think you bought those girls, and now their rightful owner wants them back. He's offering good silver for their return. No questions asked about what you might have paid for them in the first place." "Their rightful owner?" Halvard's voice carried a dangerous edge that made his horse sidestep nervously. "And who might that be?" "Lord Aldard of Northumbria. Seems these girls belonged to his household before they ran away. He's very eager to reunite with them." Halvard had never heard of Lord Aldard, but he knew the type. Powerful men didn't send mercenaries chasing runaway kitchen maids. If these men were tracking Astrid and Brenna, it meant someone with significant resources wanted the sisters badly enough to pay for their return. The implications made his blood run cold. "Well," Halvard said, his tone conversational, "it seems Lord Aldard has wasted his silver hiring you. I haven't seen any runaway girls, and I'm beginning to think you're mistaking me for someone else." "Entirely." Marcus's hand tightened on his sword. "Maybe we should search your belongings, just to be thorough." "Maybe you shouldn't." The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop several degrees. Halvard's voice remained calm, almost friendly, but something in his posture changed, a subtle shift that transformed him from tired traveler to predator. It was the same transformation that had once struck terror into the hearts of monks and merchants from Ireland to Franchedad. The younger mercenaries exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected to intimidate an aging Viking, not face down someone who radiated the quiet confidence of a man who had killed more times than he could count. Marcus, however, was either braver or more foolish than his companions. 6 against 1. Old man, those aren't good odds, even for a famous raider. "No," Halvard agreed mildly, "they're not." His sword cleared its scabbard in one fluid motion, the steel singing as it cut through the air. Before any of the riders could react, he had stepped forward and opened Marcus's throat with a precision that spoke of decades of practice. The mercenary leader toppled from his saddle without a sound, blood pooling in the fallen leaves. The remaining 5 men shouted in alarm and spurred their horses forward, but Halvard was already moving. Age might have slowed his reflexes, but it had also taught him efficiency. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourishes, just the deadly economy of violence that came from a lifetime of warfare. The second man died when Halvard's blade found the gap between his ribs. The third lost his hand to a blow aimed at his sword, then his life to the follow-up strike. The fourth tried to flee and made it 3 steps before a thrown dagger took him between the shoulder blades. The last 2 survivors pulled up hard, their horses rearing in panic at the smell of blood. They stared at Halvard with the wide eyes of men who had just realized they were facing a legend. "Go," Halvard said quietly, wiping his blade clean on Marcus's cloak. "Tell your employer that the girls are under my protection now. If he wants them, he can come himself. But send any more hired swords after us, and I'll start taking it personally." The surviving mercenaries needed no further encouragement. They wheeled their horses around and disappeared into the forest, leaving their dead companions behind. Halvard stood among the bodies for a moment, breathing heavily. The battle fury was already fading, replaced by a familiar weariness that came after violence. He had hoped those days were behind him, but apparently the past had one more lesson to teach. "You can come out now," he called softly. Astrid and Brenna emerged from their hiding place, their faces pale with shock. They stared at the carnage with wide eyes, then at Halvard, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "You killed him." "All," Brenna whispered. "Yes," Halvard said simply. He wouldn't lie to them about what he was capable of, even if the truth frightened them. "They were looking for us," Astrid said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment, processing what this meant. Someone wanted them badly enough to hire killers. Someone with resources and determination. Their freedom, such as it was, had just become infinitely more precarious. "What happens now?" she asked. Halvard sheathed his sword and began methodically, searching the bodies for anything useful: coin, food, information about who had sent them. "Now we keep traveling, but we'll need to be more careful. These weren't the only ones looking for you. Who do you think sent them? Someone who considers you valuable enough to kill for." He pocketed a small purse from Marcus's belt and straightened up. "We'll avoid the main roads from now on. Travel at night when we can. Stay in the deep woods." Astrid nodded, her tactical mind already working on the problem. "How long before we reach this home you mentioned?" 3 weeks. Maybe 4, if we have to take the long way around." He studied their faces, seeing the fear they were trying so hard to hide. "I know this is frightening, but I give you my word, as long as I draw breath, no one will harm you." Something in his tone must have convinced them, because for the first time since Winchester, both sisters seemed to relax slightly. The violence they had just witnessed should have terrified them, but instead, it seemed to have provided a strange kind of reassurance. They had seen what he was capable of, and he had used that capability to protect them rather than threaten them. "Thank you," Astrid said quietly. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Halvard allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The sisters had seen him kill for their sake, and they hadn't run. If anything, they seemed to trust him more now than before. Perhaps they understood, as he was beginning to, that sometimes love required violence, not the casual cruelty of raiders and slavers, but the focused fury of a protector defending what mattered most. The road ahead was dangerous, and there would be other hunters. But for the first time in years, Halvard felt like he was fighting for something worth the cost. They mounted up and rode deeper into the forest. 3 unlikely companions bound together by circumstance and growing trust. Behind them, the dead mercenaries served as a message to anyone else who might consider following their trail. Some prices, Halvard had learned, were worth paying in full. 3 days after the encounter with the mercenaries, the atmosphere among the 3 travelers had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The violence in the clearing had served as a strange kind of catalyst, not destroying trust, but clarifying it. The sisters now knew exactly what kind of man had bought their freedom, and more importantly, they had seen him choose their safety over his own peace. They traveled by night now, following deer paths and abandoned Roman roads that civilization had forgotten. Halvard's knowledge of the wild country proved invaluable. He seemed to know every hidden valley and forgotten track between Winchester and the northern coast. During the day, they rested in carefully chosen spots: caves, thick groves, the ruins of old settlements where smoke from a small fire wouldn't be visible from a distance. It was during one of these rest periods that Brenna first showed signs of curiosity about their protector. She was the younger sister, perhaps 14 summers, with the kind of quick intelligence that hadn't yet learned to hide itself behind caution. While Astrid maintained her watchful reserve, Brenna had begun to study Halvard with the open fascination of youth encountering something entirely outside her experience. "Were you really famous?" she asked suddenly as they sat around a tiny fire in the ruins of what had once been a Roman watchtower. Astrid shot her sister a warning look, but Halvard merely smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth the girls had seen from him. "Famous is one word for it," he said, poking at the coals with a stick. "Notorious might be more accurate. What does that mean?" "It means people knew my name, but not for good reasons." Brenna absorbed this with the serious consideration children brought to adult mysteries. "But you're not bad now." "No," Halvard agreed. "I try not to be." It was a simple exchange, but it marked the beginning of something important. For the first time since purchasing them, Halvard had allowed himself to be seen as more than just their mysterious benefactor. He was a man with a past, someone who had made choices and lived with their consequences. Astrid said nothing, but he noticed she listened carefully to every word Dot as the days passed. Small gestures began to accumulate into something approaching. Trust. Halvard shared not just his food, but his knowledge, which plants were safe to eat, how to read weather signs and cloud formations, the way to walk through forest without leaving clear tracks. He taught them to move quietly, to watch for signs of pursuit, to recognize the difference between natural forest sounds and those made by human passage. "Why are you teaching us this?" Astrid asked one evening as he showed them how to set simple snares for rabbits. "Because knowledge keeps you alive," he replied matter-of-factly. "And because," he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, "because every person should know how to take care of themselves. No one else can do it for you forever." The implication hung between them. Someday, they would need these skills without him. The thought should have been frightening, but instead, it felt oddly liberating. He wasn't trying to make them dependent on him. Quite the opposite. The breakthrough moment came on the 5th night after the mercenary encounter. They had taken shelter in a shallow cave, really little more than an overhang in a limestone cliff. But it provided protection from the cold rain that had been falling steadily since sunset. Halvard had built a small fire near the cave mouth, positioned so the smoke would be dispersed by the wind before it could mark their location. The sisters huddled together for warmth, sharing Halvard's spare cloak. They had eaten well that night. The snares had yielded 2 fat rabbits, and Halvard had found wild onions and early autumn berries to supplement their meal. For the first time in weeks, they looked almost comfortable. "Tell us about your daughters," Brenna said suddenly. The words fell into the cave like stones into still water. Halvard went very still, his hands freezing in the act of feeding twigs to the fire. Astrid shot her sister another warning look, but this time Brenna didn't retreat. "You bought us because we reminded you of them," she continued, her voice gentle but determined. "What were their names?" For a long moment, Halvard said nothing. The rain drummed against the cliff face, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called mournfully through the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ingrid and Thora. How old were they?" 15 and 12. "When?" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "When they were taken," Astrid completed softly. It wasn't a question. She had already guessed the rest of the story. Halvard nodded, not trusting his voice. "What happened to their mother?" Brenna asked with the fearless directness of childhood. "Fever. 3 years before the raid." "If she had lived," he shook his head. "If she had lived, maybe I wouldn't have been off raiding when they needed me most. Maybe I would have been there to protect them." The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. For 23 years, he had carried this guilt, and it had worn him down like water-wearing stone. "It wasn't your fault," Astrid said quietly. Halvard looked up at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Whatever happened to them," she continued, "you weren't the one who took them. You weren't the one who hurt them. You can blame yourself for not being there, but you can't blame yourself for what evil men chose to do." The wisdom in her words was startling, coming from someone so young. But then, Halvard reflected, she had seen evil up close. She knew the difference between the harm people chose to inflict and the harm they failed to prevent. "I used to tell myself that," he said. "But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your heart are different things." "Yes," Astrid agreed, and he heard the weight of her own experience in that single word. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Finally, Brenna spoke again. "Do you think they're dead?" Halvard had asked himself that question 10,000 times. Hope and despair had warred in his heart for more than 2 decades, neither quite able to claim victory. "I don't know," he said honestly. "For a long time, I told myself they must be. It seemed kinder than imagining them suffering somewhere. But lately," he paused, looking at the 2 girls who had somehow become precious to him. "Lately, I wonder if they might have been like you, strong enough to survive, smart enough to endure until someone helped them." "Maybe they did survive," Brenna said with the optimism of youth. "Maybe they're somewhere safe, with families of their own now." "Maybe." Halvard agreed, though he didn't quite believe it. Still, the possibility felt less impossible than it had a week ago. Astrid was studying his face in the firelight, her expression thoughtful. "Is that why you bought us? To make up for failing them?" The question cut straight to the heart of things. Halvard considered evading it, giving some safer answer that wouldn't expose so much of his inner landscape. But these girls had earned honesty from him. At first, "Yes," he said. "I saw you on that auction block, and all I could think was that somewhere someone might have bought my daughters the same way. Someone might have saved them if they were willing to pay the price. And now?" Astrid pressed. Halvard looked at both sisters, Brenna with her irrepressible curiosity and growing trust, Astrid with her fierce protectiveness and hard-won wisdom. They were no longer symbols of his lost daughters. They were themselves unique, precious, irreplaceable. "Now I think the gods gave me a second chance," he said simply. "Not to replace what I lost, but to do better this time. To be the kind of man who saves children instead of orphaning them." It was the most honest thing he had said since leaving Winchester, and it hung in the air between them like a bridge being built across deep water. "We're not your daughters," Astrid said gently. "No," Halvard agreed. "But maybe you could be my family anyway, if you wanted." The offer was tentative, carefully phrased to give them the power to accept or refuse. He would not presume to claim them simply because he had bought their freedom. Family was something that had to be chosen, not purchased. Brenna smiled, the first truly unguarded expression he had seen from her. "I think I'd like that." Astrid was more cautious, as always, but something in her eyes had softened. "We'll see," she said. "Time will tell." It wasn't quite acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was possibility. And that was more than Halvard had dared hope for. As they settled down to sleep, with Halvard taking first watch as always, he felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for 23 years. The guilt was still there. It would probably never fully leave him. But for the first time, it felt like something he could live with rather than something that was slowly killing him. Outside, the rain continued its steady drumming against the cliff. But inside the cave, 3 people who had been strangers a week ago were becoming something new together. Not quite a family yet, but the foundation upon which one might be built. In the morning, they would continue their journey north. There would be more dangers, more hardships, more tests of the fragile trust growing between them. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Halvard fell asleep, feeling something that might have been peace. The fever came. Without warning on the 8th day of their journey, they had been making good time through the hill country north of the old Roman wall, following shepherds' tracks that wound between stands of birch and rowan. The weather had turned crisp but clear, and for the first time since leaving Winchester, their small group had fallen into something resembling a comfortable routine. Halvard woke before dawn, as was his habit, to check their surroundings and plan the day's route. The sisters usually stirred shortly after, Astrid alert and ready, while Brenna needed a few moments to fully wake. But this morning was different. Brenna didn't wake when her sister gently shook her shoulder. When Astrid tried again, more insistently, the younger girl mumbled something incoherent and tried to burrow deeper into her blankets. "She's burning with fever," Astrid said, her voice tight with worry. Halvard was beside them in an instant, his weathered hand confirming what Astrid had discovered. Brenna's forehead was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and rapid. When he lifted her eyelid, her pupil was slow to respond to the morning light. "How long has she been sick?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Brenna had been quieter than usual the previous evening, picking at her food and complaining of being cold despite the warmth of their fire. "She said she felt tired yesterday, but I thought," Astrid's voice broke, "I thought she was just weary from traveling." Halvard nodded, understanding the self-recrimination in her tone. He had seen the same signs, but had attributed them to the stress of their flight. Now he mentally catalogued Brenna's condition: fever, delirium, rapid pulse. It could be any number of things: infection from old wounds, lung fever from sleeping, rough and damp conditions, or simply her body's delayed reaction to weeks of trauma and poor nutrition. "We need to get her warm and dry," he said, scooping the girl into his arms with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "There's a shepherd's hut about a mile north of here. Abandoned, but it has a roof and walls." The hut proved to be exactly what they needed: a small stone building with an intact thatched roof and a central fire pit. Halvard laid Brenna on a bed of pine boughs while Astrid arranged their blankets around her sister's shivering form. The girl was conscious, but barely coherent, mumbling words in what sounded like prayers or perhaps conversations with people who weren't there. "What can we do?" Astrid asked, her usual composure cracking under the weight of helplessness. "Keep her warm. Get liquids into her when she's awake enough to swallow. And wait." Halvard was already moving, his hands busy with tasks that spoke of experience with battlefield injuries and camp fevers. "I've seen this before. The body fights back from what it's endured, and sometimes the fight looks worse than the original injury." Over the next several hours, Halvard revealed a side of himself that neither sister had suspected. The same hands that had killed 6 men with brutal efficiency now moved with infinite tenderness as he bathed Brenna's fevered face with cool water. He brewed teas from herbs he gathered in the surrounding hills: willow bark for the fever, elderflower for her breathing, chamomile to help her rest. "Where did you learn this?" Astrid asked, watching him measure dried leaves with the precision of an experienced healer. "From my wife," Halvard replied, stirring honey into a cup of steaming tea. "Astrid, not you, my wife. She had the gift for healing. Said it didn't matter how good a warrior was if he couldn't keep his family healthy when the fighting was done." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife by name, and Astrid noted that they shared it. The coincidence felt like a sign, though of what, she couldn't say. "She taught you well," Astrid said as Halvard managed to coax a few sips of tea past Brenna's lips. "She tried to teach me many things." His voice carried the weight of old regret. "I was too young and too proud to listen to most of them. But the healing knowledge that saved lives on too many raids to ignore." As the day wore on, Brenna's condition grew worse before it began to improve. Her fever spiked near sunset, leaving her delirious and calling for their mother. Astrid held her sister's hand and murmured reassurances, while Halvard maintained his steady care: cooling cloths, herbal teas, patient monitoring of her breathing and pulse. "Is she going to die?" Astrid asked during the worst of it, when Brenna's Breathing became so shallow that they had to watch carefully to see the rise and fall of her chest. "No," Halvard said with a certainty that surprised them both. "She's strong, your sister. Stronger than she looks. This is her body healing itself, not breaking down. How can you be sure?" Halvard was quiet for a moment, his eyes never leaving Brenna's pale face. "Because I've lost enough people to recognize when someone is truly dying. And I've seen enough fighters recover to know when someone is winning their battle. She's winning." His confidence proved justified. Near midnight, Brenna's fever broke in a rush of sweat that soaked through her clothes and blankets. Her breathing eased, and when Astrid called her name, she responded with actual words instead of fevered mumbling. "I'm thirsty," she whispered. Astrid laughed, a sound caught between relief and exhaustion. "Thank God. Thank all the gods." Halvard helped prop Brenna up enough to drink properly, water first, then more of his herbal tea. Her eyes were clear again, though shadowed with fatigue. "What happened?" she asked, looking around the unfamiliar hut. "You were sick," Astrid explained, smoothing damp hair back from her sister's forehead. "But you're better now." Brenna's gaze found Halvard, who was cleaning up the various bowls and cups he had used throughout the day. "You took care of me." "We both did," he said simply. "But you knew how. You knew what to do." There was wonder in her voice, the amazement of someone discovering unexpected depths in a person they thought they understood. "I've had practice," Halvard replied, settling back against the stone wall with obvious weariness. The day had taken a toll on him as well, not physically, but emotionally. The fear of losing someone else he had come to care about had reopened old wounds. "Were you afraid?" Brenna asked with the directness that illness sometimes brought. Halvard considered lying, offering some reassurance that would preserve her sense of security. But honesty had become a cornerstone of whatever was growing between them. "Yes," he admitted, "very afraid." "Why?" The question hung in the small space, weighed with implications. Why should the fear of losing them matter so much to a man who had known them for barely a week? Why should their welfare have become so central to his peace of mind? "Because losing you would be like losing them all over again," he said quietly. "And I don't think I could survive that twice." The admission hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Astrid felt something shift in her chest, not quite trust, but something approaching it. This man who had purchased their freedom was revealing himself to be far more than a buyer seeking to assuage his guilt. He was becoming their protector, their healer, their father, Brenna said softly, the words slipping out before she could. "Stop it." The silence that followed was profound. Halvard's eyes widened slightly, and Astrid held her breath, wondering if her sister had gone too far, too fast. But Halvard's expression wasn't shock or rejection. It was something closer to wonder. "I haven't been called that in 23 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Is it all right?" Brenna asked, suddenly uncertain. "I mean, if you don't want—" "It's all right," Halvard assured her, and his smile was radiant. "It's more than all right." Astrid watched the exchange with mixed emotions. Part of her envied her sister's ability to trust so completely, to open her heart without reservation. But another part of her recognized the wisdom in it. This man had spent the day and night fighting for Brenna's life with the devotion of a true parent. Perhaps it was time to acknowledge what he was becoming to them. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for taking care of her, for taking care of us." Halvard nodded, understanding that this was as close to acceptance as Astrid was ready to offer. It was enough, more than enough. As Brenna drifted back to sleep, real sleep this time, not the fevered unconsciousness of illness, Astrid and Halvard maintained a quiet watch. The crisis had passed, but it had also changed something fundamental between them. "She's going to be weak for a few days," Halvard said, breaking the comfortable silence. How long before we can travel again? A week, maybe less if she recovers quickly. But we'll need to go slowly at first. Astrid nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. That was well done today. The healing, I mean. You probably saved her. Life? We saved her life, Halvard corrected gently. Your love kept her fighting when the medicine alone wouldn't have been enough. It was a generous thing to say, and Astrid felt the last of her resistance begin to crumble. This man who had bought them like property was treating them like precious family. He was proving, day by day and choice by choice, that some forms of redemption were real. Outside the hut, wind stirred the heather, and night birds called across the moors. Inside, three people who had been strangers became something more not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the simple act of caring for each other when it mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new miles to cover, new tests of the bond growing between them. But tonight, as Brenna slept peacefully between her sister and the man who was becoming their father, all was well in their small corner of the world. The healing had begun not just of Brenna's fever, but of something deeper that had been broken. In all of them. The week spent in the shepherd's hut while Brenna recovered proved to be a turning point for their unlikely family. Away from the constant pressure of travel and pursuit, they had time to simply exist together, to share stories, to learn each other's habits, and to build the foundations of genuine affection. Brenna's recovery was steady but gradual. For the first 2 days, she slept more than she was awake, her body claiming the rest it needed to fully heal. When she was conscious, she was content to lie wrapped in blankets, listening to Halvard tell stories of his homeland tales of fjords and mountains, of the northern lights dancing across winter skies, of settlements where people lived in harmony with the harsh but beautiful land. Is that where we're going? She asked one afternoon, her voice still weak but curious. Close to it, Halvard replied, whittling a small figure from a piece of birchwood. There's a valley about a day's walk from the coast where some of my kinsmen settled. Good people who've put raiding behind them. They farm now and fish and raise their children in peace. Will they accept us? Astrid asked. It was a question that had been weighing on her mind. What kind of welcome awaited two English girls in a Norse settlement? They'll accept anyone I bring home, Halvard said with quiet confidence. But more than that, they'll welcome you. My cousin Eric leads them now, and his wife Sigrid, she has a soft heart for children who need protection. They have 5 of their own, and they've taken in others over the years. The prospect of other children, of a real community, sparked something hopeful in both sisters. They had been alone with their grief and trauma for so long that the idea of belonging somewhere seemed almost impossible to believe. On the 3rd day, Astrid finally shared the full story of their capture. They had been daughters of a minor lord, whose estate bordered the disputed lands between English and Danish territories. Their father, Lord Sinric, had tried to maintain neutrality in the endless conflicts, offering tribute to both sides when necessary, and keeping his people safe through careful diplomacy. It worked for years, Astrid said, her voice carefully controlled as she recounted their tragedy. Father always said that survival was more important than pride. But then the new Danish Jarl arrived, Ivar the Cruel, they called him. He wanted more than tribute. He wanted submission. When Lord Sinric refused to formally acknowledge Danish rule over his lands, Ivar had struck swiftly and brutally. The attack came at dawn, when the household was still sleeping. Astrid and Brenna had been awakened by screams and the crash of splintering doors. Father fought them, Brenna added, her young voice heavy with memory. He told us to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were everywhere. What happened to him? Halvard asked gently. He died defending the great hall, Astrid replied. We saw him fall from the window where we were hiding. After that, she stopped, unable to continue. After that, they found us, Brenna finished, quietly, Ivar kept us for a week, saying we might be useful for negotiations. But then he decided we were more trouble than we were worth and sold us to the slave traders. Halvard felt a familiar rage building in his chest, not the berserker fury of his youth, but the cold, purposeful anger of a man who had seen too much injustice. Ivar the Cruel. He had heard the name before, whispered in the taverns and market. Towns where Vikings gathered to trade stories and information. A man who gave their people a bad name, who embodied all the worst aspects of their warrior culture without any of its honor. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Your father sounds like a good man who tried to protect his people." "He was," Astrid agreed. "And now you're doing the same for us." The comparison seemed to surprise Halvard. He had never thought of himself as particularly good, quite the opposite, in fact. But looking at these girls who had somehow come to trust him, he began to wonder if goodness might be less about past actions and more about present choices. On the fourth day, as Brenna grew strong enough to sit up and take solid food, they encountered their first real test since the mercenaries. Halvard was outside gathering firewood when he heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders, moving at a casual pace that suggested they weren't actively hunting but might investigate anything interesting they found. He slipped back into the hut and motioned for silence. Through gaps in the stone walls, they watched as the riders approached Danish warriors by their gear and bearing, well-armed and confident. Not the sort of men who would simply ride past an occupied shelter without investigating. "Stay quiet," Halvard whispered, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "Let me handle this." The lead rider called out in Danish as they drew near the hut. "Ho there! Anyone home?" Halvard stepped outside, adopting the casual posture of a traveler taking temporary shelter. He responded in the same language, his accent marking him as a fellow Norseman. "Just passing through. The girl took sick, so we're resting until she can travel." The riders dismounted, and Halvard could see them taking in details: his weapons, his bearing, the quality of his gear. They were evaluating him, trying to determine if he posed a threat or represented an opportunity. Asterisk. "What girl?" the leader asked, his tone deceptively casual. Asterisk. "My daughter," Halvard replied without hesitation. "She caught a fever from sleeping rough." "Funny," the second rider interjected. "We heard there were 2 English girls traveling with an old Viking. Runaway slaves, supposed to be valuable." "Well, you heard wrong," Halvard said mildly. "Though, if you know where I might find such valuable cargo, I'd be interested in purchasing it myself." The lie came easily, backed by decades of experience in dangerous conversations. But these weren't ordinary bandits or mercenaries. These were professional warriors, and they hadn't survived this long by accepting everything at face value. "Mind if we take a look inside?" the leader asked. Just to satisfy our curiosity. It wasn't really a request. Halvard could see the way they had positioned themselves, surrounding him, cutting off his retreat to the hut. If he refused, they would take it as confirmation that he was hiding something valuable. "Of course," he said agreeably. "Though I should warn you, she's been quite ill. Might be catching." The mention of illness gave them momentary pause, but not enough to deter them completely. They followed him toward the hut's entrance, hands resting casually on their sword hilts. Inside, they found exactly what Halvard had promised: a sick girl wrapped in blankets, attended by what appeared to be her older sister. Astrid had thought quickly, mussing her hair and affecting the weary look of someone who had been nursing an invalid. Brenna, still genuinely weak from her recent fever, looked appropriately fragile and unwell. "Norse girls," Halvard explained, noting their pale coloring. "From my cousin's settlement. I'm taking them home after their mother died." The leader studied both sisters carefully, and Halvard could see him mentally comparing them to whatever description he had been given. Astrid met his gaze steadily, but without challenge, playing the part of a grieving daughter perfectly. They look English to me, one of the other riders said. Half English, Halvard agreed readily. Their mother was a captive my cousin took to wife. It happens. It was exactly the kind of mixed heritage that was common in the borderlands, and the explanation had the ring of truth. More importantly, it accounted for their appearance while maintaining Halvard's story. The leader wasn't entirely convinced, but he also wasn't prepared to start a fight over what might be a case of mistaken identity. After a few more probing, questions that Halvard answered with consistent calm, the riders prepared to leave. If you do happen to come across 2 English runaways, the leader said as they mounted their horses, there's good silver in it for whoever brings them in. 100 pieces for both, alive and unharmed. 100 silver pieces, 5 times what most men earned in a year. The price confirmed what Halvard had suspected. These girls were far more valuable than ordinary slaves. Someone very powerful wanted them back and was willing to pay accordingly. I'll keep that in mind, Halvard said neutrally. After the riders disappeared over the hills, the 3 of them sat in shaken silence. The encounter had been handled smoothly, but it had driven home the reality of their situation. They weren't just fleeing generic pursuit. They were the object of a systematic hunt with significant resources behind it. 100 silver pieces, Astrid said quietly. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. It is, Halvard agreed. Aren't you tempted? She asked, studying his face. It would solve all your problems. You could buy a farm, start over somewhere peaceful. Halvard looked at both sisters, Brenna still pale from illness, but watching him with complete trust. Astrid trying to hide her fear behind practical questions. The 100 silver pieces might solve his financial problems, but it would create far worse ones. Some things once broken could never be repaired. I already have everything I need, he said, simply thought it was true. Somewhere between Winchester and this moment, these girls had become more precious to him than silver or safety or peace. They were his family now, and family was worth any price. Besides, he added with a slight smile, your sister called me. Father, that makes you both mine to protect, not mine to sell. Brenna reached out and took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his scarred ones. Thank you. Astrid said nothing, but something in her expression had shifted. The last of her defensive walls were finally beginning to crumble. That night, as they planned their route for the remaining journey to the coast, Halvard felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life for 23 years. The girls trusted him completely now, and more importantly, he trusted himself. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The hunt was closing in, but they were no longer just 3 desperate fugitives fleeing through the wilderness. They were a family, bound by love and choice and shared adversity. And families, Halvard had learned, could survive anything as long as they stood together. Asterisk. After 6 days of recovery, Brenna was strong enough to travel again, though Halvard insisted on a slower pace than before. They left the shepherd's hut in the pre-dawn darkness, following a route that would keep them well away from the main roads where Danish patrols might be searching. The landscape was changing as they moved north. The rolling hills gave way to rougher country moors covered in purple heather, ancient stone circles that spoke of peoples who had lived and died long before either Danes or English had claimed these lands. It was beautiful in its wildness, but also unforgiving. Perfect country for those who needed to disappear. 3 days into their renewed journey, they had their closest call yet. They were crossing a shallow valley when Halvard spotted movement. On the ridge behind them, riders, at least a dozen, moving in the purposeful pattern of hunters following a trail. Even at this distance, he could see the disciplined way they spread out to cover the maximum area. These weren't bandits or casual opportunists. These were professional trackers. Down, he commanded quietly, pulling the sisters behind a cluster of standing stones that offered concealment. through gaps between the ancient monoliths. They watched the hunting party work its way across the moor. The riders were methodical, checking every possible hiding place, following every path that might have been used by travelers trying to avoid detection. "They're tracking us," Astrid whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Yes," Halvard agreed grimly. "And they're good at it. Too good." Despite all his precautions, traveling at night, avoiding roads, masking their trail wherever possible, somehow they had been found. It suggested resources and expertise beyond what they had faced so far. "What do we do?" Brenna asked, pressed close against her sister's side. Halvard studied the terrain ahead, his tactical mind working through their options. The valley offered no real concealment, and the moors beyond provided little cover for anyone trying to evade mounted pursuit. But there was another possibility, a more dangerous one, but also more final. "There's a place about 2 miles north of here," he said quietly. "An old hill fort from the Roman times. Stone walls, defensible positions, water from a spring. If we can reach it before they spot us, we can hold them off," Astrid finished, understanding immediately. "Some of us could," Halvard corrected. "But it would mean fighting, and fighting means some of us might not survive." The alternative hung unspoken between them. They could surrender, hope that their captors intended to keep them alive long enough to collect whatever reward was being offered. It might be the safer choice, at least in the short term. "No," Brenna said suddenly, her young voice firm with unexpected determination. "We don't surrender. We don't go back." Astrid looked at her sister with surprise. The girl who had been so sick just days ago was now showing a core of steel that matched her elder sister's fierce protectiveness. "Are you sure?" Halvard asked, gently. "Once we make this choice, there's no going back. We'll be committed to seeing it through, whatever the cost." Both sisters nodded, their faces set with the kind of resolve that comes from having already lost everything once. They had found safety and family with Halvard, and they would rather die defending it than lose it again. "Then we run," Halvard said simply. The next hour was a desperate race across increasingly rough terrain. Halvard led them through deer tracks and sheep paths, using every scrap of fieldcraft he had learned in 40 years of warfare. Behind them, the hunting party spread out like a net, their shouts echoing across the moors as they coordinated their search. Twice they nearly walked into outriders, who had circled ahead to cut off possible escape routes. Each time, Halvard's experience and the sisters' growing skills at moving quietly through wilderness saved them from detection. But with each near miss, the net drew tighter. The hill fort, when they finally reached it, was both more and less than Halvard had hoped. The walls were indeed ancient, and strong, massive stones fitted together by long-dead craftsmen who had understood the art of fortification. But time and weather had taken their toll. Gaps had opened in several sections, and what had once been a formidable stronghold was now merely a defensible ruin. "It will have to do," Halvard muttered, leading them through what had once been the main gate. Inside the fort's walls, they found the spring he had remembered, clear water bubbling up from deep underground, surrounded by the remnants of a stone basin built by Roman engineers. There was also shelter in the form of partially collapsed buildings that could provide protection from arrows and weather. "How long can we hold out here?" Astrid asked as Halvard began checking their supplies. "Depends on how determined they are," he replied honestly. "We have food for maybe 3 days, water indefinitely. But if they're willing to sit and wait, eventually we'll have to come out. Maybe they'll give up," Brenna suggested hopefully. Halvard didn't have the heart to tell her that men willing to track them this far across hostile country weren't likely to be deterred by stone walls and inconvenience. Whoever wanted them back was paying too well for that dot. They spent the remaining daylight preparing their defenses. Halvard positioned their few belongings to create choke points in the gaps between stones, places where attackers would be forced to come at them one at a time. He showed the sisters how to use their eating knives as weapons. Though he prayed it wouldn't come to that dot as sunset painted the sky in shades of red and gold. Their pursuers finally appeared on the ridge overlooking the fort. Halvard counted them through a gap in the wall 15 mounted warriors, well armed and showing no signs of fatigue despite their long pursuit. The leader rode forward alone, stopping just within shouting distance of the walls. "Halvard of the Western Fjords," he called out in accented English. "I am Kenneth the Red, and I've come a long way to find you." Halvard felt ice form in his veins. Canute the Red, he knew that name, knew the man who bore it. They had served together under Harald Bluetooth, had fought side by side in the great raids against the Frankish coast. Canute had been a friend once, or as close to a friend as men like them ever managed. "I hear you," Halvard called back, not showing himself but making sure his voice carried clearly. "Then you know why I'm here," Canute continued. "Those girls you're protecting, they're worth more than silver to certain interested parties. Important people want them back, Halvard. The kind of people who don't take no for an answer." "What people?" "Does it matter? The price is good, and the alternative is dying in that ruin for no purpose. Send the girls out, and you can walk away from this. Hell, I'll even cut you in for a share of the reward." "What do you say?" From their hiding place behind the stone wall, Astrid and Brenna could hear every word. They looked at Halvard with eyes that held no accusation, no demand that he choose them over his own safety. They had learned to trust his judgment completely, even in this. "I say the girls are under my protection," Halvard replied, "and they stay that way." Canute's laughter echoed off the stone walls. "Still a stubborn bastard, I remember. You always did have a talent for making things harder than they needed to be. Some things are worth being stubborn about. Like a couple of English runaways? Come now, Halvard. Since when do you care about slaves and their troubles?" The question cut deeper than Canute probably intended. Since when indeed? Since he had seen his own failures reflected in two frightened girls on an auction block. Since he had learned that redemption sometimes came through protecting the innocent rather than destroying them. Since I decided to stop being the kind of man who sells children to the highest bidder, Halvard replied. Another pause, then Canute's voice again, harder now. "Last chance, old friend. Send them out, or we come in and take them." Halvard looked at Astrid and Brenna, seeing his own determination reflected in their young faces. They had all chosen this path together, knowing where it might lead. "Then come ahead," he called back. "But know that it will cost you." Canute's response was a string of creative profanity that would have been impressive under other circumstances. Then there was silence, broken only by the sound of horses moving and men preparing for battle. "They'll wait until dark," Halvard told the sisters as he made final adjustments to their defenses. "Night fighting favors the defenders in a place like this. They'll try to rush us then, hoping to overwhelm us before we can make full use of our advantages. Are you afraid?" Brenna asked, echoing her question from days earlier. "Yes," Halvard admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing you both again." "You haven't failed us," Astrid said firmly. "Whatever happens tonight, you've given us more than we ever dared hope for. You've given us a family." As darkness fell over the ancient hill fort, three people, who had found each other in the worst of circumstances, prepared to defend what they had built together. The odds were long, the enemy was skilled and determined, and the night would test every bond they had forged. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. Asterisk. The attack came with the new moon, when darkness lay thick across it. More and the only light came from scattered stars. Halvard had positioned himself at the main gap in the wall, with the sisters crouched behind a fallen stone that would provide protection from arrows. His sword lay ready at his side, along with a Danish war axe he had taken from one of the mercenaries. they had killed days earlier. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then, finally, came the soft sound of men moving carefully through the heather, trying to approach without alerting their quarry. Halvard smiled grimly. Canute had always been too confident in his own stealth. The first warrior to appear in the gap died quickly and quietly, Halvard's blade finding his throat before he could cry out. The second managed a strangled shout before falling, alerting the others to the fact that their approach had been detected. After that, subtlety was abandoned in favor of overwhelming force. They came from 3 directions at once. Through the main gap, over a low section of wall to the east, and through a narrow breach on the western side. Professional tactics, designed to divide the defenders' attention and prevent them from concentrating their fire. But Halvard had been fighting against odds like these for most of his adult life. He moved through the darkness with the deadly efficiency of long experience, his blade finding targets with unerring accuracy. The confined space of the fort worked in his favor. The attackers couldn't bring their superior numbers to bear all at once, and each gap became a choke point where one man could hold off several. Still, there were too many of them. For every warrior Halvard killed, 2 more seemed to take his place. Arrows began to whistle through the darkness, and he heard Astrid gasp as one passed close enough to tear her sleeve. "Stay down," he called over the clash of weapons, driving back another attacker with a vicious overhand strike that split the man's skull like a melon. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Halvard's world narrowed to the immediate threats in front of him: sword thrust to parry, axe blow to duck, warrior charging through the gap who needed to die before he could bring his weapon to bear. But even legends grew tired, and Halvard could feel his strength beginning to ebb. A glancing blow from a warhammer sent him staggering, and only luck kept him from being overwhelmed in that moment of weakness. Then, suddenly, a horn sounded from outside the walls, long, deep notes that echoed across the moor. The attacking warriors pulled back immediately, their discipline overriding whatever bloodlust might have driven them to continue the assault. "Hold!" Canute's voice carried clearly through the night air. "Fall back and regroup." In the sudden silence that followed, Halvard sagged against the stone wall, breathing heavily. His sword arm ached, and he could feel blood running from several minor wounds. But he was alive, and more importantly, the sisters were unharmed. "What's happening?" Astrid whispered. Before Halvard could answer, torches began to appear outside the walls. Not just a few, but dozens, far more than Canute's hunting party could account for. As the lights drew closer, they revealed a sight that made Halvard's blood run cold. A full warband had arrived, at least 50 warriors on foot, with more mounted men visible in the distance. At their head rode a figure that Halvard recognized from reputation, if not personal acquaintance. A tall man in rich furs and gold arm rings, his dark hair streaked with premature gray, and his face marked by the kind of scars that came from commanding men in battle. Ivar, the Cruel, had come for his prizes personally. "Ah, Halvard," Canute called out, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "I'd like you to meet my new employer. I think you'll find him very persuasive." Ivar rode forward until he was close enough for conversation, his mount picking its way carefully over the rough ground. Even in the torchlight, his eyes seemed to gleam with an intelligence that was somehow more frightening than simple brutality. "Halvard of the Western Fjords," he said, his voice cultured and pleasant. "Your reputation precedes you. I'm told you once burned 3 monasteries in a single day during the Great Raid on Ireland." "I was younger then," Halvard replied carefully. Indeed. We all do foolish things in our youth. Take myself, for instance. I once let sentiment override good judgment. Allowed 2 valuable hostages to slip through my fingers because I thought they were more trouble than they were worth. Ivar's smile was cold as winter ice. It's a mistake I don't intend to repeat. They're not hostages anymore, Halvard said. They're my daughters. Are they? Ivar seemed genuinely amused. How interesting. Tell me, did they mention who their father was? Their real father, I mean? Something in his tone made Halvard's stomach clench with sudden dread. Beside him, he heard Astrid draw in a sharp breath. Lord Sinric of Eastmark, Ivar continued conversationally. A minor noble who thought he could play both sides in our little conflict. But also, it turns out, something rather more significant than he appeared. The Danish Jarl reached into his saddlebags and withdrew something that gleamed gold in the torchlight. A heavy torque of twisted metal, marked with symbols that Halvard recognized as royal insignia. Sinric was Queen Glethryth's younger brother, Ivar explained, holding up the torque so that everyone could see it clearly. Which makes his daughters, your daughters, as you so touchingly put it, direct heirs to the throne of Mercia. The words hit Halvard like a physical blow. Royal blood. That explained everything. The massive reward, the systematic hunt, the resources being expended to track down two supposedly insignificant slave girls. They weren't just valuable as hostages or curiosities. They were pawns in the great game of kingdoms and succession. Surprised? Ivar asked, noting Halvard's expression. The girls didn't know either, I suspect. Their father was wise enough to keep that particular secret, even from his own children. But secrets have a way of coming to light when there's enough gold involved. Halvard felt the sisters move behind him, heard Astrid's strangled gasp as she processed the implications. Their entire world had just shifted again, revealing depths of complexity they had never imagined. What do you want? Halvard asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. What I've always wanted: leverage, control, the power to shape events rather than simply react to them. Ivar's expression grew serious. With the girls in my possession, I can pressure the Mercian nobility to accept Danish rule. Or I can sell them to their own people for a ransom that would make kings weep. Either way, they represent opportunity on a scale that dwarfs any previous consideration. They're children, Halvard said desperately. Whatever their bloodline, they're still just children who've lost everything. Royal children, Ivar corrected, which makes them the most valuable commodity in this part of the world. Surely you understand that, as a man who once made his living taking valuable things from other people. The accusation stung because it was true. How many families had Halvard destroyed in his raiding days? How many children had he orphaned or enslaved without a second thought? The gods, it seemed, had a sense of irony. That was before, he said quietly. Before what? Before I learned that some things are worth more than gold. Ivar studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a particularly complex puzzle. You really have changed, haven't you? The Halvard I heard stories about would have bargained for a share of the profit by now. The Halvard you heard stories about was a fool who thought strength meant taking whatever he wanted, Halvard replied. I've learned better. Have you? Ivar's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. Then let me offer you a choice, and we'll see just how much you've learned. Give me the girls willingly, and I'll allow you to walk away from this. You'll even receive a modest payment for your trouble call, with compensation for your expenses. And if I refuse? Then I take them anyway, after we've finished killing you and anyone else who stands in my way. The only difference is that your sacrifice will be meaningless because the outcome remains the same. It was a cruel choice, but a logical one. Ivar was offering Halvard the chance to save his own life while acknowledging that the girl's fate was already sealed. From a purely practical standpoint, there was no benefit to dying for a cause that was already lost. But as Halvard looked at Astrid and Brenna, at the fear and desperate hope warring in their young faces, he realized that practicality had nothing to do with it. These girls had called him father. They had trusted him with their lives, their futures, Their capacity for love after trauma had tried to destroy it. He had failed his first daughters. He would not fail these ones. "I choose to stand with my family," Halvard said simply. Ivar nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. "I thought you might say that. Very well then. Canute, take your men and finish this. Try to keep the girls alive and unharmed. They're no use to me damaged." As the Danish warriors began to advance again, now in overwhelming numbers, Halvard felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had made his choice, and it was the right one. Whatever happened next, he would face it with honor. "I'm sorry," he said quietly to the sisters. "I should have been stronger. I should have found a way to get you to safety." "No," Astrid said fiercely, her young voice carrying absolute conviction. "Don't you dare apologize for being the best father we could have asked for." Brenna reached out and squeezed his hand. "We love you," she said simply. As the enemy warriors closed in for the final assault, Halvard smiled. He had lived for 60 years, but these past weeks, watching these girls learn to trust again, feeling their love transform him into someone worthy of the title father, these had been the most meaningful of his entire life. Let Ivar take his prizes. Let the games of kingdoms and succession continue their bloody course. For a brief, shining moment, Halvard had been part of something pure and good and worth defending. That was enough. That was everything. The battle resumed with renewed fury, but this time there would be no retreat, no tactical withdrawal. This was the end, one way or another. And in the ancient stone circle, under the watching stars, a father prepared to die for his daughters, not the ones he had lost, but the ones he had chosen to save. Asterisk. The renewed assault never came. Instead, as Canute's warriors prepared to advance, another horn sounded from the darkness, beyond the torchlight, different in tone from the Danish war horns, deeper and more resonant. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the ancient stones and rolling across the moor like thunder. Ivar's head snapped up, his expression shifting from confident control to sharp concern. "What is that?" he demanded of his lieutenants. Canute was already moving, calling orders to his men to form defensive positions. "War horns," he said grimly. "Multiple war bands, moving fast. We're about to have company." From their position behind the stone wall, Halvard felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. He recognized those horn calls, not the specific patterns, but the style. Norse horns, blown by men who knew their craft. But whether they represented salvation or simply a different variety of destruction remained to be seen. The first arrows came whistling out of the darkness beyond the torches, finding targets among Ivar's packed warriors with lethal accuracy. Men cried out and fell, and suddenly the Danes found themselves fighting on two fronts, the stubborn defender in the hill fort behind them, and an unknown force attacking from the moorland. "Form up." Ivar roared, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Square formation! Shields to the outside!" But his men were already scattered, spread out for the assault on the fort. Reforming under arrow fire, while torches made them perfect targets, was easier ordered than accomplished. More warriors fell as the unseen archers found their marks. Then the real attack began. They came out of the darkness like wolves, 40 or 50 Norsemen in full battle gear, moving with the coordinated precision of a veteran warband. Their leader was a massive man with braided red hair and arms like tree trunks, wielding an enormous war axe that seemed to sing as it cut through the night air. "Eric!" Halvard called out in recognition, his voice carrying across the battlefield. Eric Bloodaxe, Halvard's cousin, the man who led the settlement they had been traveling toward. But how had he known to come here? How had he found them in time? The answer came when Halvard spotted a familiar figure among the attacking Norsemen, a slight, dark-haired boy who moved with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself in his first real battle. Olaf, one of Eric's younger sons, who had always been fascinated by tales of his father's warrior days. The boy must have been out ranging ahead of the settlement's hunting parties, had spotted the signs of their passage and followed them here, smart enough to recognize trouble when he saw it, wise enough to run for help instead of trying to intervene alone. "Uncle!" Olaf's voice carried clearly as he fought his way toward the hill fort. "We saw the torches. Father brought everyone." Everyone. Indeed. As the battle raged around the ancient stones, Halvard could see more warriors emerging from the darkness. Not just Eric's core warband, but farmers and fishermen who had taken up weapons to help one of their own. The Norse settlement had emptied itself to come to his aid. The tide of battle turned quickly. Ivor's men were skilled and disciplined, but they had been expecting to overwhelm a single defender, not fight a pitched battle against fresh troops in unfavorable terrain. Caught between the fort and Eric's warriors, they found themselves being systematically destroyed. Ivor himself fought with the desperate fury of a man who saw his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. His sword work was brilliant, and for a time he carved a circle of death around himself that even Eric's veterans couldn't penetrate. But there were too many of them, and eventually sheer numbers began to tell. "This isn't over," he shouted as his remaining men began to fall back toward their horses. "Those girls belong to me by right of conquest. I'll have them back, and anyone who stands in my way will burn. Come and try." Eric roared back, his great axe dripping with Danish blood. "But next time, bring more men." The surviving Danes managed to reach their mounts and fled into the darkness, leaving behind nearly half their number dead on the bloody ground around the hill fort. Cunard was among the fallen. Halvard's old friend had died with a Norse spear through his chest. His face twisted in an expression of bitter surprise as the sounds of battle faded into the distance. An exhausted silence settled over the ancient stones. Eric's warriors began the grim work of checking the dead and tending to their own wounded, while the settlement's farmers and fishermen stood around looking slightly stunned by what they had just accomplished. Eric himself strode through the main gap in the wall, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire space. He looked older than when Halvard had last seen him, more gray in his red hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but the strength was still there, the presence that had made him a natural leader among their people. "Well, cousin," he said, clasping Halvard's arm in the traditional warrior's greeting, "you certainly know how to make an entrance. When young Olaf came racing back to tell us you were under siege, we thought he might be exaggerating." "If anything, he understated the situation," Halvard replied, returning the clasp with genuine warmth. "Eric, I can't begin to tell you." "No need," Eric interrupted. "Family is family. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about your companions." He looked past Halvard to where Astrid and Brenna stood near the stone wall, their faces pale with shock but their eyes bright with the aftermath of terror and relief. They hugged each other tightly, as if afraid that letting go might cause this salvation to vanish like a dream. "My daughters," Halvard said simply. Eric's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't question the claim. Among their people, family was often a matter of choice as much as blood. "They're welcome in our settlement, of course, though I suspect there's a story behind all this that will take some telling." "There is," Halvard agreed, "but perhaps not tonight. We've all had enough excitement for one evening." As if to emphasize his point, Brenna swayed suddenly, her recent illness and the stress of the night finally catching up with her. Astrid caught her sister before she could fall, but it was clear that both girls were at the end of their endurance. "Sigrid will want to fuss over them," Eric said, noting their condition. "You know how she is with strays and wounded things. Half the settlement's children are ones she insisted we take in from somewhere." The thought of Eric's gentle wife tending to the sisters brought a smile to Halvard's face. Sigrid had the gift of making everyone feel like family, regardless of their origins or circumstances. The girls would be safe with her, cared for and loved while they continued to heal from their trauma. "There's something else you should know," Halvard said quietly, moving closer so the sisters wouldn't overhear. "Those girls, they're not just refugees. They're royal blood. Mercian princesses." Eric's expression grew serious. "That explains the interest from our Danish friend. Royal hostages are worth their weight in gold to ambitious jarls. Will it be a problem? For the settlement, I mean." Eric considered the question carefully. His people had chosen peaceful lives, turning their backs on the raiding and warfare that had once defined Norse culture. Taking in royal fugitives could bring unwanted attention from kings and jarls who might view the settlement as a threat. "It might be," he admitted, "but that's a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, they're children who need protection, and we're the ones with the strength to provide it." It was exactly the answer Halvard had hoped for, and it reminded him why he had always respected his cousin despite their very different paths in life. Eric had the rare quality of seeing people as individuals rather than just political complications. The journey back to the settlement took 3 days, but they were the most peaceful days Halvard had experienced in weeks. Eric's warband provided security, while the farmers and fishermen had brought wagons that allowed the girls to ride in comfort. Instead of walking the rough moorland paths, Astrid and Brenna gradually relaxed as it became clear that their ordeal was truly over. They rode with Sigrid, Eric's wife, who had insisted on coming along to see to the girls properly. Within hours of meeting them, she had appointed herself their surrogate mother, fussing over their health and asking gentle questions about their preferences for food and clothing. "She's wonderful," Brenna confided to Halvard on the second evening, as they sat around the campfire, listening to the settlement's storyteller spin tales of ancient heroes. "She reminds me of," she stopped, suddenly sad. "Of your mother?" Halvard guessed gently. Brenna nodded, wiping away tears she was trying not to shed. "I thought I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone take care of me just because they wanted to." "Sigrid has that effect on people," Halvard said. "She collected Eric the same way, back when he was young and angry and thought fighting was the answer to everything. What changed his mind?" Halvard looked across the fire to where Eric was deep in conversation with his warriors, planning the settlement's defenses against possible future attacks. Despite his peaceful intentions, the man was still a tactician at heart. "Love," Halvard said simply. "Love for Sigrid. Love for the children they raised together. Love for the community they built." He discovered that protecting something beautiful was more satisfying than destroying something ugly. It was a lesson Halvard was still learning himself, but one that felt truer with each passing day. On the third morning, they crested a hill and saw the settlement spread out below them, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings clustered around. A natural harbor where fishing boats bobbed at anchor. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sound of children's laughter carried clearly on the morning breeze. "Home," Eric said with satisfaction. "Finally." But as they descended toward the welcoming buildings, Halvard noticed riders approaching from the south, a small group moving fast as if bearing urgent news. Eric saw them too, and his expression grew grim. "More trouble?" Halvard asked. "Probably," Eric replied. "Good news rarely travels that fast." The lead rider reached them just as they entered the settlement's outskirts. He was young, probably one of the scouts Eric kept posted along the southern approaches, and his face was flushed with exertion and worry. "Jarl Eric," he gasped, pulling his lathered horse to a halt. Ships on the horizon. Danish longships, at least a dozen of them. Flying Ivar's banner. Eric's jaw tightened. "How long before they reach us?" 2 hours, maybe 3 if the wind doesn't pick up. Halvard felt ice form in his stomach. Ivar hadn't given up after all. He had simply regrouped, called in reinforcements, and was now bringing enough force to overwhelm any resistance the settlement might offer. "He's coming for us?" Astrid said quietly, having overheard the exchange. Her face was pale but determined. This is our fault. We've brought this down on all of you. No, Eric said firmly. This is Ivor's choice, not yours. And we'll deal with it the same way we've dealt with every other threat to our people together. As the settlement came alive with the controlled urgency of people preparing for siege, Halvard looked at the girls who had become his daughters and the cousin who had risked everything to save them. They had found sanctuary, but keeping it would require one more battle. The final test was coming, and this time there would be nowhere left to run. Asterisk, the settlement transformed with remarkable speed. What had been a peaceful fishing village moments before became a fortress preparing for war. Eric's people moved with the efficiency of those who had drilled for this possibility many times, even if they had hoped never to use that training. Fishing boats were pulled up onto the beach and turned into barriers, their hulls providing cover for archers. Livestock was driven into pens in the center of the settlement, while anything that might be useful to attackers was moved inside the defensive perimeter or destroyed. Children and elderly who couldn't fight were gathered in the Great Hall, the largest and most defensible building in the settlement. Halvard found himself swept up in the preparations, his military experience making him a natural coordinator for the defensive efforts. But his mind kept returning to the two girls who were the cause of all this violence. He found them in Sigrid's house, helping her gather medical supplies and prepare for the wounded that would inevitably come. Both sisters worked with quiet determination, their faces set with the kind of resolve that comes from accepting an unavoidable fate. "This has to stop," Astrid said without looking up from the bandages she was rolling. "People are going to die. Because of us." "People die in wars anyway," Sigrid replied gently, her hands never pausing in their work. "At least this time, we know what we're fighting for." "Two girls who aren't even really part of your community," Brenna said, her voice heavy with guilt. Sigrid finally stopped what she was doing and turned to face both sisters directly. Her expression was kind but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had helped build this settlement from nothing. "Child," she said, "you became part of this community the moment Halvard claimed you as his daughters. We don't abandon family, and we don't surrender to bullies just because fighting back is dangerous." Before either girl could respond, the bronze bell mounted near the harbor began to toll 3 long strokes followed by 2 short ones. The signal that enemy ships had been sighted. Halvard appeared in the doorway, his war gear already strapped. "On. It's time," he said simply. The sisters looked at each other, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Astrid stepped forward, her young face set with determination that reminded Halvard painfully of his own daughters at that age. "We want to help," she said. "Absolutely not," Halvard replied immediately. "You're staying here, in the safest place we can manage." "We can fight," Brenna added, moving to stand beside her sister. "You taught us to use knives, to move quietly. We're not helpless." "I know you're not helpless," Halvard said, his voice gentle but implacable. "But you're also not warriors. This isn't your battle to fight." "It's exactly our battle," Astrid countered. "Ivor is coming for us. These people are risking their lives to protect us. The least you can do is stay alive," Halvard interrupted. "Because if something happens to either of you, then everything we've done, every life that might be lost today, becomes meaningless." The harsh truth of his words silenced both girls. They wanted to help, to contribute something meaningful to their own defense, but they were also smart enough to understand the larger picture. Their survival was the only victory condition that mattered. From outside came the sound of Eric's voice raised in command, organizing the final defensive positions. The Danish ships would be visible from the harbor soon, and with them would come the moment of truth. "I have to go," Halvard said, moving toward the door. Then he stopped, and turned back, his weathered face suddenly showing all of his 60 years. "I want you both to know," he said quietly, "that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Whatever happens today, you've already given me more than I ever dared hope for." Astrid's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "You saved us, Father. In every way that matters, you saved us." Brenna simply ran to him and threw her arms around his waist, hugging him with the fierce love of a child who had finally found safety in a dangerous world. "Come back to us," she whispered. "I will," Halvard promised, though they all knew it. It was a promise that might be beyond his power to keep. He left them in Sigurd's care and made his way to the harbor, where Eric was making final adjustments to their defensive positions. The settlement's warriors, perhaps 30 men who could handle weapons with real skill, were spread along the waterfront, supported by twice that many farmers and fishermen who had taken up spears and bows. "Thoughts?" Eric asked as Halvard joined him at the command position. "We're outnumbered at least 4 to 1, Halvard replied, studying the approaching sails. "But we have good ground and better motivation. If we can make the landing costly enough, maybe they'll decide the prize isn't worth the price." Eric nodded grimly. "That's what I was thinking. Break their first assault, make them bleed for every yard, and hope they lose heart before we run out of men." It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. Ivar's reputation wasn't built on restraint or mercy. If he wanted the royal sisters badly enough to bring a fleet, he wasn't likely to be deterred by heavy casualties. The Danish longships came in fast, their experienced crews driving them up onto the beach with practiced precision. Warriors leaped over the sides before the boats had fully grounded, their shields locked and weapons ready. These weren't the mixed mercenaries and opportunists that Halvard had faced before. These were professional killers, veterans of a dozen campaigns. "Steady," Eric called to his men as the Danes formed their battle line. "Let them come to us." The attack began with a rain of arrows from both sides. The Danes had brought their own archers, and their aim was devastatingly accurate. Several of the settlement's defenders fell in the first exchange, but they gave as good as they got. Bodies began to pile up on the narrow beach as the missile duel continued. Then came the charge. The Danish shield wall advanced with mechanical precision, their overlapping shields deflecting most of the arrows while their own spearmen thrust at any target that presented itself. Behind them came more warriors, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The first clash was brutal. Eric's men held their ground with desperate courage, but the pressure was enormous. Slowly, inevitably, they began to give way before the superior numbers and experience of their attackers. Halvard found himself in the thick of the fighting, his sword work as deadly as ever, despite his age. But for every Dane he killed, 2 more seemed to take their place. The mathematics of the battle were inexorable. They were being overwhelmed through simple attrition. "Fall back," Eric commanded as another section of their line crumbled. "Second position." The retreat was conducted in good order, the defenders using prepared barriers and choke points to slow the Danish advance. But it was still a retreat, and everyone knew that each yard of ground given up brought the enemy closer to the helpless civilians in the Great Hall. The battle raged through the settlement streets, house by house and building by building. The Norse defenders made every advance costly, but they were running out of both men and space. Soon they would be forced back to the Great Hall itself, and then there would be nowhere left to go. It was then that the unexpected happened. A new horn sounded from the harbor, not Danish, but not quite Norse either. The fighting paused as both sides tried to identify this new element, and in that moment of confusion, fresh sails appeared on the horizon. English warships, flying the banner of MERCI, ***. The arrival of the Mercian fleet changed everything. Ivar's warriors, who had been pressing their advantage through the settlement streets, suddenly found themselves caught between two forces. Behind them, Eric's defenders rallied with renewed hope. Ahead of them, beyond the harbor, English longships were disgorging fresh troops onto the beach. "How many?" Eric gasped, blood running from a cut above his eye as he tried to count the new arrivals. "8 ships," Halvard replied, wiping his sword clean on a fallen Dane's cloak. "Maybe 200 men. Enough to turn the tide if they're here to help us." The question of English intentions was answered quickly. The Mercian warriors formed ranks on the beach and advanced toward the settlement. But their target wasn't the Norse defenders. It was Ivar's forces, caught now between hammer and anvil. The Danish Jarl recognized his impossible position immediately. His voice carried clearly over the sounds of battle as he called for his men to regroup and form a defensive square. They were skilled enough to execute the maneuver even under pressure, but their situation remained desperate. "Parley!" Ivar shouted, his voice cutting through the clash of weapons. "I call for parley." The fighting gradually died away as both sides pulled back slightly, weapons still ready, but no longer actively seeking targets. In the sudden quiet, the sound of approaching footsteps was clearly audible as someone walked through the English ranks toward the center of the settlement. The man who emerged was clearly a leader. His armor was finely crafted. His bearing spoke of long command, and the golden circlet around his brow marked him as nobility. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered look of someone who had spent as much time in the field as in royal halls. "I am Edmund, Earl of Mercia and Regent for Queen Glothrith," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the battlefield. "I come seeking my nieces, the daughters of my brother Cynric." Halvard felt his heart sink. He had hoped that the English arrival might mean rescue for the sisters, but if this earl was claiming them as family, their situation might have improved only marginally. Royal relatives could be just as dangerous as foreign enemies when political. Advantage was at stake. "Your nieces are under my protection," Ivar called back, his tone carefully diplomatic despite his desperate circumstances. "Perhaps we might discuss terms for their safe return?" Edmund's laugh was cold as winter iron. "Terms? You murdered my brother, burned his hall, and enslaved his children. The only terms I'm interested in discussing involve how quickly you want to die." The Mercian Earl's words carried a personal fury that suggested this wasn't just about political necessity. He had genuinely cared for his brother and wanted vengeance for the family's destruction. But Ivar wasn't finished playing his games. "The girls aren't with me, I'm afraid. They're somewhere in this settlement, hidden away by the Norse who bought them from me. If anything happens to me, you might never find them." It was a desperate bluff, but a clever one. Edmund couldn't simply order an assault if there was a chance his nieces might be killed in the fighting. He needed them alive and safe before he could allow his men to finish what they had started. "Bring them out," Edmund commanded, his gaze sweeping across the Norse. "Defenders, bring out the daughters of Lord Cynric, and I give you my word that my quarrel is with the Danes alone." Halvard exchanged glances with Eric. This was the moment of truth. Would they hand over the girls they had fought so hard to protect, trusting in the word of an English lord they didn't know? Or would they try to keep fighting, risking not just their own lives, but those of everyone in the settlement? The decision was taken out of their hands. Astrid and Brenna appeared at the entrance to the great hall, having apparently slipped away from Sigrid despite all efforts to keep them safe. They walked forward with the kind of dignity that spoke of royal blood, their heads high and their steps steady despite the carnage around them. "Uncle Edmund," Astrid said formally, offering a slight curtsy that somehow managed to be both respectful and defiant. "You're looking well." Edmund's stern expression cracked, revealing genuine emotion underneath the political facade. "Astrid and little Brenna, thank God you're both alive." "We're alive because of him," Brenna said, moving to stand beside Halvard. "He saved us when no one else would." Edmund's gaze shifted to study Halvard with new interest. A Viking raider turned protector? That's an unexpected development. I'm no longer the man I was, Halvard replied simply. These girls changed that. Did they? Edmund stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Or are you simply hoping to profit from their rescue? Royal gratitude can be quite valuable. The accusation stung, particularly because Halvard could understand how it might appear to outsiders. A notorious Viking raider suddenly appearing as the protector of royal hostages. It did seem suspiciously convenient, but Astrid stepped forward before Halvard could respond, her young voice carrying all the authority of her bloodline. Uncle, this man spent his last silver to buy our freedom. He fought armies to protect us, nursed us when we were sick, and became the father we needed when we had lost everything else. If you question his motives, you question our judgment, and I promise you, we are not children who can be easily fooled. Her words carried such conviction that even Edmund seemed taken aback. He studied both girls carefully, looking for signs of coercion or manipulation, but finding only genuine affection and loyalty. Very well, he said finally. But you'll understand if I want to hear the full story before making any commitments. It was Ivar who interrupted, his patience finally running out. How touching. But while you're having your family reunion, I'm still surrounded by hostile armies. Shall we discuss my safe passage out of here? Edmund's expression hardened again. Your safe passage? You seem to be confused about your situation. You're a murderer and a slaver, surrounded by people who want you dead. The only passage you're getting is the one to your grave. Kill me, and you'll never know how many other English nobles I've captured and sold. Ivar replied desperately. I have information you need, names, locations, buyers. Surely that's worth something. It might have been under other circumstances. But Edmund's fury over his brother's death wasn't something that could be bargained away with promises of future intelligence. The only information I need from you is how long it takes you to die, Edmund said coldly. What followed wasn't really a battle, it was an execution. Caught between the Mercian forces and Eric's rallied defenders, the remaining Danes fought with the desperate courage of doomed men. Ivar himself died with a Norse spear through his chest, his schemes and ambitions ending in the mud of a fishing village he had probably never heard of before today. God, as the last of the Danish warriors fell, an exhausted silence settled over the settlement. The survivors began the grim work of tending wounds and counting their dead, while the smoke from burning ships drifted across the harbor. It's over, Brenna said quietly, leaning against Halvard's side as they watched the English soldiers secure the area. Yes, Halvard agreed. It's over. But even as he spoke the words, he wondered what would come next. The girls were safe, but they were also royal. Their uncle had come to reclaim them, to take them back to the world of courts and politics they had been born to. Would there be a place for an aging Viking in that world? Or was this reunion also a goodbye? The battle was won, but the war for his daughter's future was just beginning. Asterisk. 6 months later, Halvard stood on the dock of Eric's settlement, watching fishing boats return with the evening catch. The harbor had been rebuilt after the battle, stronger than before, with new watchtowers and defensive positions that would discourage future raiders. The settlement had paid a price for their victory, 7 good men dead, and twice that number wounded, but they had survived and grown stronger for it. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention to the beach, where a group of youngsters were playing some complicated game that seemed to involve a great deal of running and shouting. Among them, he could see Brenna teaching the settlement's children a dance she had learned at her father's court. At 16 now, she had grown into the poise that her royal blood promised, but she had retained the warm heart that had first called Halvard father in a shepherd's hut. Astrid was harder to spot, but he knew where to look. She would be in the Great Hall, working with Sigrid on the settlement's accounts and trade agreements. At 18, She had become Eric's unofficial advisor on matters involving the English kingdoms, her noble education proving invaluable in the complex negotiations that kept their communities safe and prosperous. Both girls had chosen to stay. The decision hadn't been made immediately. When Earl Edmund had first arrived, he had naturally assumed that his nieces would return with him to Mercia, to take their places in the royal court and fulfill their dynastic obligations. He had been genuinely puzzled when they asked for time to consider the offer. "This is your birthright," he had argued during the long discussions that followed the battle. "You are the daughters of kings, with duties to your people and your heritage." "Our people are here now," Astrid had replied quietly. "And our father, our real father in every way that matters, is here too." Edmund had struggled to understand. From his perspective, Halvard was a useful ally who had rendered valuable service, but hardly someone whose wishes should outweigh royal necessity. The girl's attachment to him seemed like a temporary aberration that would fade once they returned to their proper station in life. He had been wrong. The turning point came when Edmund observed them together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as a genuine family. He saw Halvard patiently teaching Brenna to whittle, his large hands guiding her small ones as she learned to shape wood into useful tools. He watched Astrid seek her adoptive father's counsel on everything from settlement politics to matters of the heart, treating his wisdom as if it were worth more than royal gold. Most tellingly, he saw the way Halvard looked at both girls, with the fierce, protective love of a man who would die before letting harm come to them. It was the same expression Edmund remembered seeing on his own father's face, the same devotion that had made their family strong. "You really love them," he had said to Halvard one evening as they sat by the fire discussing the day's negotiations. "More than life itself," Halvard had replied without hesitation. "And they love you. I'm blessed beyond any right to expect it." Edmund had been quiet for a long moment, processing this reality that didn't fit his expectations. "I came here expecting to find two traumatized children in need of rescue. Instead, I find two young women who have found their place in the world." "They found their strength in each other," Halvard had corrected gently. "I just tried to give them space to heal." The negotiations that followed were complex, involving questions of succession, allegiance, and political necessity that stretched over weeks. But in the end, a solution had been found that satisfied everyone's needs. The girls would remain in the settlement as official representatives of Mercia, serving as liaisons between the English kingdoms and the Norse communities along the coast. It was a position that honored their royal blood while allowing them to stay with the family they had chosen. Eric's settlement would receive royal protection and trading privileges, while Edmund gained valuable allies in a strategically important region. Everyone won, but more importantly, everyone found peace. Now, as autumn painted the hills in shades of gold and red, Halvard reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A year ago, he had been a broken man wandering slave markets and looking for a way to ease his guilt. Today, he was a respected member of a thriving community, father to two remarkable young women, and perhaps most surprisingly, content with his place in the world. "Brooding again?" Eric asked, joining him on the dock with 2 cups of ale. "Thinking," Halvard corrected, accepting the drink gratefully. "About how things change." "They do that," Eric agreed. "Usually when we're not paying attention." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the harbor. In the distance, sails appeared on the horizon, merchant ships coming to trade, not warships bringing destruction. The sight had become a common one since word spread of the settlement's royal connections and defensive capabilities. "Any regrets?" Eric asked. Halvard considered the question seriously. He thought of his first daughters, lost so many years ago, and the life he might have lived if he had been there to protect them. He thought of the young man he had been, so sure that strength meant taking what he wanted, so convinced that honor came from the fear he inspired in others. "About the past, yes," he said finally, "but not about the choices that brought me here." "Good," Eric said, "because I have news that might test that resolve." Halvard raised an eyebrow questioningly. "A messenger arrived this afternoon while you were helping with the nets. Earl Edmund is sending a proposal for Astrid's marriage to a young lord from Wessex, apparently. Good family, solid alliance potential, all very politically advantageous." Halvard felt his stomach clench. He had known this day would come eventually. Astrid was 18, of marriageable age, and her royal blood made her a valuable piece in the great game of dynastic politics. But knowing it was inevitable didn't make it any easier to contemplate. "What does she think?" he asked. "She wants to discuss it with you first," Eric replied with a slight smile. "Apparently, she told the messenger that she would need her father's blessing before considering any marriage proposals." The simple statement hit Halvard with unexpected force. After everything they had been through, after all the royal uncles and political negotiations, Astrid still considered him her father first and foremost. His opinion mattered more to her than royal protocol or political advantage. "She's a remarkable young woman," he said quietly. "Takes after her father," Eric replied with a grin. "The stubborn streak, anyway." Before Halvard could respond, the sound of running feet announced Brenna's approach. She arrived on the dock slightly out of breath, her face flushed with excitement, and something that might have been worry. "Father," she said, the title coming as naturally as breathing after all these months, "Astrid needs to see you. There's a messenger and papers, and she's doing that thing where she pretends everything is fine, but her jaw gets tight." Halvard smiled despite his concern. Brenna had developed an uncanny ability to read her sister's moods, a skill that had proved invaluable in helping Astrid navigate the complex emotions of their new life. "I'll go to her," he assured the girl. "But first, tell me, how do you feel about the possibility of your sister marrying?" Brenna's expression grew serious, revealing the thoughtful intelligence that lay beneath her usual cheerful demeanor. "I think she should marry someone who loves her for who she is, not what she represents. And I think anyone who tries to take her away from us permanently is going to have a very unhappy family to deal with." It was exactly the answer Halvard had hoped for: protective but not possessive, loving but not selfish. Whatever decisions lay ahead, they would make them as a family. He found Astrid in the great hall, seated at the long table where the settlement conducted its business. Before her lay several documents bearing official seals, and her expression was indeed tight with controlled emotion. She looked up as he entered, and her face immediately softened. "Father," she said, rising to embrace him, "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk. So I've heard. A marriage proposal? Among other things." She gestured to the papers spread before him. "Uncle Edmund has been busy. The marriage proposal is just part of a larger plan to strengthen Mercia's position along the northern borders." Halvard studied the documents, his reading skills adequate to parse the formal language of royal correspondence. The proposal was indeed politically advantageous. The young lord in question was heir to significant lands in Wessex, and the alliance would create a strong buffer against Danish expansion. "What? Do you think of him?" he asked. "This Lord Godwin?" "I've never met him," Astrid admitted. "But his letters are thoughtful, and Uncle Edmund speaks well of his character. He seems decent, honorable. But—" Astrid was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "But accepting means leaving here. Leaving you and Brenna and Eric and Sigrid and everyone who's become family to me. It means becoming Lady Godwin of Wessex instead of Astrid, daughter of Halvard." "You would still be my daughter," Halvard said gently. "Marriage doesn't change that, doesn't it?" Astrid's voice carried a note of uncertainty that reminded him she was still young, despite her poise and intelligence. What if his family doesn't accept me? What if they see me as the Viking raider's daughter rather than Sinric's heir? What if I'm not strong enough to maintain who I've become when I'm surrounded by people who expect me to be someone else? The questions revealed the heart of her struggle. She had found herself in this settlement, had learned to trust and love and be loved in return. The prospect of leaving that security for the unknown, even for marriage to a good man, was genuinely frightening. "Do you want to marry?" Halvard asked. "Not this lord specifically, but anyone? Do you want a husband and children and a household of your own?" Astrid considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. "Someday, but I want to choose. When and whom, not have it chosen for me by political necessity. Then tell your uncle that." "It's not that simple," Astrid protested. "There are obligations, duties to the kingdom and the family name. I can't just ignore them because I'm comfortable here." Halvard sat down beside her, his weathered hands covering her younger ones. "Astrid, what did I tell you when I first brought you and Brenna to safety?" She thought back to those early days of fear and uncertainty. "That some things are worth more than gold. And what have you learned since then?" "That love is the most valuable thing of all," she replied without hesitation. "Then, trust that," Halvard said simply. "Make your decision based on love for yourself, love for your family, love for the life you want to build. If this marriage serves love, then consider it. If it serves only duty and politics, then perhaps it's not the right path." They talked long into the evening, discussing not just the marriage proposal, but all the complex choices that came with royal blood and family obligations. By the time Brenna joined them for the evening meal, Astrid's expression had cleared, the tight worry replaced by determined calm. "I've decided to write to Lord Godwin directly," she announced. "I want to know more about him as a person before making any commitments. And I want him to know that I come with attachments, a family that I won't abandon, and a life here that matters to me." "That seems wise," Halvard agreed. "Will you help me write the letter?" Astrid asked. "I want to strike the right tone, respectful, but honest." It was a small request, but it meant the world to Halvard. She was asking for his guidance not because she had to, but because she valued his counsel. After a lifetime of taking what he wanted by force, he had learned the deeper satisfaction of being trusted with what mattered most. Over the following weeks, letters traveled back and forth between the settlement and Wessex. Lord Godwin proved to be as thoughtful and decent as Earl Edmund had suggested. His correspondence revealed a young man who was intelligent, kind, and genuinely interested in Astrid as a person rather than just a political alliance. More importantly, when Astrid explained her attachments to her adopted family and her role in the settlement, he didn't dismiss them as childish sentiment. Instead, he suggested that perhaps there might be ways to honor both her royal obligations and her personal commitments. The solution, when it came, was elegant in its simplicity. The wedding would take place in the settlement with both families present. Afterward, Astrid and Godwin would divide their time between Wessex and the Northern Territories, strengthening the bonds between the kingdoms while allowing her to maintain her connections to the life she had built. "It's not perfect," Astrid admitted on the day before her betrothal ceremony, "but it's honest. It acknowledges who I've become, not just who I was born to be." "That's all any of us can ask for," Halvard replied, adjusting the silver circlet. That marked her royal status, the chance to become who we're meant to be. The ceremony itself was a blend of traditions, Norse and English, royal and common, formal and heartfelt. Earl Edmund performed the official betrothal in his capacity as Astrid's guardian, while Halvard offered the traditional father's blessing. Lord Godwin proved to be exactly as his letters had suggested, thoughtful, respectful, and clearly devoted to his bride-to-be. But the moment that meant the most to Halvard came during the feast afterward, when Astrid stood to address the gathered company. "I want to thank everyone who has made this day possible," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the great hall. "My Uncle Edmund, who traveled far to ensure my safety and happiness. My intended husband Godwin, who has shown such patience and understanding. The entire settlement, who welcomed two frightened strangers and made them family." She paused, her gaze finding Halvard in the crowd. "But most of all, I want to thank my father, not the one who gave me life, but the one who taught me how to live it. Halvard of the Western Fjords, who showed me that strength isn't about taking what you want, but about protecting what you love. Who proved that it's never too late to choose who you want to be." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Halvard barely heard it. He was too busy trying to process the fact that this remarkable young woman, royal heir, political leader, beloved daughter, considered him worthy of such public honor. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Brenna appeared at his side with a cup of ale and a mischievous smile. "So," she said, "what do you think? Will you be able to handle having a lord for a son-in-law?" Halvard chuckled, pulling her into a one-armed hug. "I think I can manage. Though I suspect he's going to find having a Viking for a father-in-law much more challenging." "He'll be fine," Brenna said confidently. "Astrid wouldn't have chosen him if he couldn't handle our family." Our family. The word settled into Halvard's heart like a benediction. After 60 years of life, 40 of them spent believing he was irredeemably lost, he had found his way home. Not to a place, but to the people who loved him despite knowing exactly who he had been and who he was becoming. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Halvard stepped outside to look up at the stars. The same constellations that had guided his longships during the raiding years now shone down on a settlement full of laughter and joy, on two daughters who had chosen to call him father, on a future that held promise instead of just regret. He thought of Ingrid and Thora, his first daughters, and for the first time in 23 years, the pain of their loss didn't overwhelm him. Instead, he felt a sense of completion, not because the old wounds had healed completely, but because he had learned to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of his life. Redemption, he had discovered, wasn't about erasing the past or earning forgiveness through grand gestures. It was about choosing love over vengeance, protection over destruction, hope over despair. It was about becoming the kind of person who saved children instead of orphaning them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to prove that change was possible, even for the most unlikely candidates. But tonight, surrounded by family and filled with gratitude for the strange path that had brought him here, Halvard was content. He had found his way home at last.